August 13th, 1996. The small Belgian town of Graceholland woke to a nightmare that would define an entire nation for years. Two girls, Julie Lejeune, 8 years old, and Melissa Rousseau, 8 years old, had disappeared while walking from the public swimming pool back to their homes. It was an ordinary summer day. The girls had spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, being children. Their parents waited for them at home, planning dinner without worries. In 1990s Belgium, children still walked freely through their neighborhoods. Small communities like Graceholland were places where everyone knew everyone, where children were safe, or so they thought. When Julie and Melissa didn't arrive home by 6 p.m., their parents began to worry. By 7 p.m., they were frantic. By 8 p.m., they had called the police. And by midnight, the entire town was searching for the two dark-haired girls who had simply vanished. Witnesses reported seeing an old white van lurking near the pool. Others had seen two men who appeared to be watching the children. But in the chaos of that first night, details were confused, descriptions contradictory. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Julie and Melissa weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. They were about to discover something that would shake Belgium to its foundations. Something that would expose corruption, cover-ups, and horrors so deep they would forever change how Belgians viewed their own institutions. The Dutrix affair was about to begin. I need to stop here and speak to you directly, because this story is going to be difficult. It's one of the darkest I've ever told, but it's important and it needs to be told. Where are you listening right now? Are you at home in Mexico City, lying in bed in Bogota, or perhaps driving through the streets of Madrid? Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Leave your location in the comments. It helps me know we're a global community, all trying to understand how these things happen, how to prevent them. If this is your first time here, you need to know something. This channel treats true crime cases with the utmost respect for victims. We're not here to entertain. We're here to remember, to learn, to ensure these stories aren't forgotten. If that resonates with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're already part of this family, thank you. Your comment, sharing this video with someone who understands why these stories matter. All of that allows me to continue this work. Now, I have to warn you, the Dutrix case involves crimes against children. I'll be respectful, but the facts are disturbing. If you need to pause, do so. Take care of your mental health. These stories are important, but your well-being is too. Let's return to Belgium, August 1996. Because while Julie and Melissa were disappearing, investigators didn't know they had already had the monster responsible in their hands and had let him go. Marc Dutrix was no stranger to Belgian police. Not even close. He had a criminal history that should have raised every possible red flag. In 1989, Dutrix and his then-wife had been arrested for kidnapping and raping 5 girls. The crimes had been brutal, calculated, monstrous. Dutrix had drugged his victims, tortured them, filmed them. When he was caught, prosecutors asked for life in prison. Instead, he received 13 years. And after serving only 3 years, he was released for good behavior in 1992. Let me repeat that. A man who had kidnapped and raped 5 children served 3 years in prison. 3 years. The prison psychiatrist who recommended his release wrote in his report that Dutrix represented an extreme danger to society, that he was almost certain to reoffend, that he should never be released. But somehow, despite this explicit warning, Dutrix walked free. Once out, he did exactly what the psychiatrist had predicted. He began hunting again. Dutrix didn't work alone. He had recruited his new girlfriend, Michelle Martin, to help him. Together they purchased several properties around Belgium, old, dilapidated houses in quiet neighborhoods where no one asked questions. In the basements of these houses, Dutrix built dungeons. Concrete cells hidden behind false walls. Rooms less than 2 meters square where he could keep his victims hidden, sometimes for months. The rooms had no windows, no proper ventilation, no heating. They were tombs for the living. And in 1995, a full year before Julie and Melissa disappeared, Dutrix began filling them. June 24, 1995. Julie and Melissa were still playing carefree in their neighborhoods, unaware that horror was coming. But two other girls had already fallen into Mark Dutrix's clutches. And Marshall, 17 years old, and Yves Lambrex, 19 years old, had been camping in the Belgian coastal area when they disappeared. They were best friends, enjoying a summer trip together. Families reported their disappearance immediately, but the investigation stalled. What they didn't know was that Dutrix and his accomplice Michel Lelivre had kidnapped them, drugged them, and transported them to one of Dutrix's properties in Sars-la-Bessière. There, in one of his basement dungeons, he kept the girls for weeks. I cannot and will not detail what he did to them during that time. It's enough to say they suffered horribly. And sometime in late summer 1995, Dutrix killed them and buried their bodies in the yard of another of his properties. And then Yves became murder victims, but their bodies wouldn't be found for more than a year. And meanwhile, Dutrix was hunting again. In August 1995, just weeks after killing Anne and Yves, he kidnapped a 12-year-old girl on her way home from school. He kept her in his basement dungeon for months, subjecting her to unspeakable abuse. He would eventually release her, one of the few victims who survived, but not before inflicting trauma that would scar her for life. Police knew these girls had disappeared. They had missing persons reports. They had desperate families begging for help. But investigations went nowhere, resources were limited, and cases went cold. Meanwhile, Dutrix was building his operation, refining his methods, growing bolder. And then came the summer of 1996. When Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau disappeared on August 13, 1996, their families did everything one would do. They distributed flyers. They spoke to media. They organized searches. They pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Gino Russo, Melissa's father, became the face of the investigation. His anguish was palpable in every interview, every public appeal. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "If anyone knows anything, anything at all, help us bring our girls home." What Gino didn't know was that Mark Dutrix had been watching Julie and Melissa for days before the kidnapping. He had seen them at the pool, noticed their routines, planned exactly when and where to strike. The day of the abduction, Dutrix and his accomplice Michel Lelivre simply drove alongside the girls in their white van, grabbed them off the street in broad daylight, and drove away. The entire attack took less than a minute. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the girls had vanished. Dutrix took them directly to his house in Marcinelle, to a basement dungeon he had prepared specifically for them. The cell measured approximately 2 meters by 1. It had no natural light. The air was stale and hard to breathe. There was a dirty mattress on the floor and nothing else. There, in that concrete prison, Julie and Melissa would spend months. Months of terror, of hunger, of abuse. Months wondering if anyone would ever come to save them. And here's the most heartbreaking part. Someone almost did. 2 months after Julie and Melissa were kidnapped, while they were still alive in Dutrix's basement, police received a tip about Mark Dutrix. An informant had suggested he might be involved in car thefts. On December 13, 1995, police came to arrest Dutrix for car theft. They took him into custody, leaving his house empty. In the basement, Julie and Melissa heard the commotion upstairs. They heard voices. It must have been a moment of desperate, terrible hope. Had they finally come to rescue them? But no one checked the basement. No one searched for the hidden dungeons. And Dutrix went to prison for just the car theft, leaving the girls trapped in his underground tomb. Michelle Martin, Dutrix's girlfriend, knew the girls were there. She knew they were locked in the basement, without food, without proper water, slowly dying. She had the keys to the house. She could have freed them. She could have called police. She could have brought them food. Instead, she did nothing. She let them starve to death. Julie and Melissa survived for weeks alone in that dungeon. We can imagine their terror, their confusion about why no one came. We can imagine the hunger slowly consuming them, the desperation growing with each passing day. Sometime in early 1996, both girls died of starvation. They died just feet from where Dutrix had stored food. They died while he sat comfortably in a prison cell. They died because police didn't search hard enough, because Michel Martin chose to let them die, because the system failed at every possible point of intervention. When Dutrix was released from prison in March 1996, he returned home to find their bodies. He buried them in the backyard alongside his other victims. And then he went out to hunt again. May 28, 1996, barely 2 months after Julie and Melissa died, Marc Dutrix kidnapped 2 more girls. Sabine Dardenne was 12 years old when Dutrix grabbed her off her bicycle as she rode to school. Letitia Delhez, 14 years old, was taken similarly on August 9, 1996, just 4 days before the anniversary of Julie and Melissa's kidnapping. But this time, something was different. This time, there were witnesses. Several people saw Letitia being forced into an old van. They wrote down part of the license plate number. They provided descriptions of the vehicle. And this time, police acted quickly. The investigation led them to Marc Dutrix. On August 13, 1996, exactly 2 years after Julie and Melissa were taken, police executed a search warrant on Dutrix's property in Marcinelle. They expected to find evidence related to Letitia's kidnapping. What they found was much, much worse. In the basement, behind a metal shelf, was a hidden door. Behind that door was the dungeon. And in that dungeon, alive but barely, were Sabine Dardenne and Letitia Delhez. The girls were rescued, rushed to hospital, reunited with their families. The relief of their survival was overwhelming, but the questions their rescue raised were terrifying. If Dutrix had 2 girls alive, how many others had he had? How many hadn't survived? After Dutrix's arrest, police began the gruesome task of searching all his properties. He had several houses scattered around Belgium, each purchased with money that supposedly came from unemployment and small scams. But investigators soon discovered that Dutrix had been far more prosperous than his reported income suggested. He owned properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He drove expensive cars. He lived comfortably despite having no legitimate employment. Where did the money come from? As investigators tried to trace his finances, forensic teams began excavating the yards of his properties. And there, in the earth behind the house in Sars-la-Bessière, they found the bodies. And Marcel and Yves Lambrex, the 2 girls who had disappeared in 1995. Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, the 8-year-old girls who had been dead for months while all of Belgium searched for them. And Bernard Weinstein, an accomplice of Dutrix whom Dutrix had murdered and buried to keep him quiet. The excavations were broadcast live on Belgian television. The entire nation watched in horror as small bodies were removed from the ground. The trauma was collective, national, profound. But what truly shocked Belgium wasn't just the murders. It was what came out afterward about how much the authorities knew and when they knew it. As details of the Dutrix case came to light, the Belgian public began asking questions. And the answers they got were absolutely terrifying. In 1993, years before Julie and Melissa were kidnapped, an informant told police that Marc Dutrix was building cells in his basements to keep children captive. Police investigated or claimed to investigate but found nothing. In 1995, another informant told authorities that Dutrix was offering money to people to kidnap children for him. Again, the investigation led nowhere. When police arrested Dutrix for car theft in 1995, they had full access to his house, the same house where Julie and Melissa were starving to death in the basement. 2 different officers visited that house. Both reported hearing children's voices, but both were instructed by their superiors not to investigate further. Let me repeat that. Police officers heard children's voices in the home of a known pedophile who had been reported for kidnapping children, and they were told not to investigate. Worse still, documents showed that Dutrix had been investigated at least 30 times between 1992 and 1996. 30 times, authorities had opportunities to stop him. And 30 times, the investigation was closed without action. How was this possible? How could a known, already convicted child predator continue operating so openly while being actively investigated? The Belgian public began to suspect this was more than incompetence. This looked like a cover-up. Marc Dutrix, when arrested, made claims that electrified and horrified Belgium. He claimed he wasn't a lone wolf but part of a network, an organized network of child abuse that included some of the most powerful people in Belgium. According to Dutrix, he kidnapped children under orders. He kept them in his basement dungeons, but not just for himself. He claimed he was paid to provide children to wealthy and powerful men, politicians, judges, police officers, prominent businessmen, who abused them at organized parties. Dutrix's claims were initially dismissed as the ravings of a monster trying to avoid responsibility. But then witnesses began coming forward. Multiple surviving victims described being taken to parties where other children were present, where well-dressed men paid for access to them. They described large houses, lavish parties, men with money and power. One witness, known as X1, gave hours of testimony describing a network of child abuse that included ritual murder, child pornography, and trafficking. She named specific names, politicians, judges, businessmen. Her testimony was detailed, consistent, and absolutely terrifying. But authorities dismissed her as not credible. They said she was mentally unstable, that her testimony couldn't be trusted. Yet they never properly investigated the claims she made. Other witnesses came forward with similar stories, and one by one they were dismissed, discredited, or ignored. Meanwhile, key aspects of the investigation seemed to be actively sabotaged. Jean-Marc Connerat was the investigating judge initially assigned to the Dutrix case. He was incorruptible, meticulous, and absolutely determined to get to the bottom of what had happened. Connerat believed Dutrix was part of a larger network. He began investigating connections between Dutrix and high-profile individuals. He began asking questions about why so many previous investigations had stalled. He began looking into whether there had been a systematic cover-up. And then, suddenly, he was removed from the case. The official reason was a conflict of interest. He had attended a spaghetti dinner held by a victims' support organization. This minor act of solidarity with victims was used as a pretext to remove him from the most important investigation of his career. When Connerat was removed, 300,000 Belgians, 3% of the entire population of the country, marched in protest in what became known as the White March. They demanded justice. They demanded answers. They demanded to know why their system kept failing to protect children. Connerat's successor, Judge Jacques Langlois, took a very different approach to the investigation. He dismissed the network theory. He focused strictly on Dutrix and his direct accomplices. Investigations into broader connections were shut down. And then people connected to the investigation started dying. In 1995, before the Dutrix case even broke, a man named Michel Nihal, who would later be implicated in Dutrix's network, was involved in an accident that killed Belgian intelligence agent Aldo Michiki. Michiki had supposedly been investigating child pornography networks. In 1998, the lead investigator in the Dutrix case, Gendarmerie Brigade René Michaud, died under suspicious circumstances. Michaud had been one of the officers who heard voices in Dutrix's house but was instructed not to investigate. He had lived with that guilt, and he had been cooperating with journalists to expose what he believed was a cover-up. In total, at least 27 witnesses or people connected to the Dutrix case died in unusual circumstances before they could testify. 27. Some died in car accidents. Some committed suicide, though family members disputed these conclusions. Some simply disappeared. The pattern was impossible to ignore. And yet, authorities insisted there was no conspiracy, no cover-up, just a series of tragic coincidences. Marc Dutrix's trial finally began in 2004, a full 8 years after his arrest. It was one of the most publicized trials in European history, drawing media attention from around the world. Dutrix, his ex-wife Michelle Martin, and his accomplices Michel Lelivre and Michel Nihal all faced multiple charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder. The prosecution's case relied on physical evidence from Dutrix's properties, testimonies from surviving victims Sabine and Letitia, and Dutrix's own confession to some of the crimes. But Dutrix continued to insist he had been working for a larger network. He named names, political figures, judges, people in positions of power. He claimed he was just a pawn, that the real people responsible had never been investigated. The court dismissed these claims. The judge didn't allow the defense to investigate the network theory extensively. Witnesses who would have supported Dutrix's claims weren't called. The investigation was strictly limited to Dutrix's direct acts and his immediate accomplices. Sabine Dardenne, one of the survivors, testified at the trial. Her testimony was heartbreaking. She described the months she spent in Dutrix's dungeon, the abuse she endured, the psychological terror of believing she would never escape. But she also said something that resonated with those who believed there was a broader conspiracy. She described hearing multiple voices in Dutrix's house. She described being moved to different locations. She described indications that there were other people involved beyond just Dutrix. Yet these claims weren't properly investigated. On June 17, 2004, the verdicts were delivered. Mark Dutrix was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Michel Martin received 30 years. Michel Lelivre 25 years. Michel Nihoul was acquitted of the main charges but received 5 years for drug trafficking. But for many Belgians, the trial raised more questions than it answered. Even after the trial, key aspects of the Dutrix case remain unexplained. How could Dutrix, unemployed and living on welfare, afford multiple properties worth hundreds of thousands of euros? The investigation into his finances was superficial at best. Why were dozens of warnings about Dutrix ignored? Why did so many investigations close without explanation? Why were officers who heard children's voices in his house instructed not to investigate? What about the witnesses who described organized parties where children were abused? Why was their testimony dismissed without proper investigation? And what about the 27 deaths of people connected to the case? Were they really all coincidences? Investigative journalist Olenka Frankiel, who covered the case extensively, concluded there was a deliberate system of protecting people in high places. She pointed out that every time the investigation seemed to reach higher levels of Belgian society, it hit walls. Documents disappeared, witnesses died, investigators were removed. Not everyone believes there was a wide network of elite abusers. Some argue the evidence for such a conspiracy is circumstantial, that Dutrix was simply a monster who took advantage of system incompetence. But even those skeptics admit there were massive system failures at every level. Whether deliberate conspiracy or stunning incompetence, the result was the same. Children suffered and died while those with the power to intervene did not. The Dutrix case fundamentally changed Belgium. Trust in institutions, police, the judicial system, the government, was shattered. The White March of 1996 was just the beginning. Thousands of Belgians became activists, demanding judicial system reforms, better child protection, greater accountability from public officials. The case exposed weaknesses in how criminal investigations were handled. It showed that different police agencies, the gendarmerie and local police, often didn't share information. It showed that crimes against children weren't always prioritized. It showed that the system could be manipulated or evaded by those with connections. In response, Belgium implemented major reforms. Separate police forces were merged into a single federal police service. Procedures for investigating crimes against children were standardized. Tracking systems for convicted sex offenders were implemented. More resources were given to missing persons investigations. But for many Belgians, these reforms came too late. They wouldn't bring back Julie, Melissa, and Yves or Bernard. They didn't undo the trauma experienced by Sabine, Letitia, and other survivors. The case also created deep divisions in Belgian society. Those who believed in the network theory saw a massive cover-up reaching the highest levels of power. Those who rejected it saw conspiracy theorists exploiting a tragedy. These divisions continue to this day. Sabine Dardenne and Letitia Delhez survived their ordeals at the hands of Mark Dutrix. But survival came with a cost they would carry for the rest of their lives. Sabine spent 80 days in captivity. During that time, Dutrix convinced her that her parents didn't want to find her, that no one was looking for her, that he had rescued her. The psychological manipulation was almost as traumatic as the physical abuse. After her rescue, Sabine faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. She became an advocate for victims' rights, wrote a book about her experiences, and spoke publicly about the importance of listening to children. But she also faced harassment and stigma. Some people blamed her, as if a 12-year-old girl could somehow be responsible for her own kidnapping. Others treated her trauma as entertainment, asking for morbid details of her ordeal. Letitia, who was held captive for only 6 days before the rescue, faced similar challenges. Her testimony was crucial to convicting Dutrix, but reliving the trauma in court took a toll. Other survivors, those Dutrix had abused in his earlier crimes in the 1980s, also had to live knowing the system had failed them. If Dutrix had served his full original sentence, if he had never been released, Julie, Melissa, and Yves and all the later victims would have been safe. The weight of those what-ifs is unbearable. Michelle Martin, Marc Dutrix's ex-wife, presented a complicated moral question. What was her level of culpability? She didn't dispute the basic facts. She knew Julie and Melissa were locked in the basement. She knew they were starving to death. She had the ability to save them. She didn't. Her defense argued she was a victim of domestic violence, controlled and terrorized by Dutrix. They claimed she was too afraid to disobey him, that she believed he would kill her if she freed the girls. The prosecution rejected this. They pointed out that Martin had access to phones, that she could have called police anonymously. They argued that her decision to let the girls starve to death was deliberate and calculated. The court found her guilty of complicity in their murder. She received 30 years in prison. But in 2012, after serving only 16 years, Michelle Martin was released on parole. The decision sparked outrage in Belgium. The victims' parents were devastated. How could the woman who allowed their daughters to starve to death walk free? The decision was particularly controversial because Martin was released to a convent where she worked as an assistant. The Catholic Church had intervened on her behalf, arguing she deserved a second chance. Gino Russo, Melissa's father, stated publicly, "She could have saved our children. Instead, she chose to let them die. That choice must have consequences." But the consequences, it turned out, were limited. And for many Belgians, this was just another sign that the system favored perpetrators over victims. The question that persists, more than 2 decades later, was Marc Dutrix part of an elite pedophile network? Or was he a lone monster who exploited system deficiencies? Those who believe in the network theory point to several pieces of evidence. Dutrix's unexplained finances, how an unemployed man owned multiple properties and lived comfortably. The testimony of multiple victims describing organized parties with wealthy men. The dozens of failed investigations despite repeated warnings. The 27 deaths of witnesses and people connected to the case. The removal of investigators who tried to investigate broader connections. The strict limitation of the judicial investigation to only Dutrix and immediate accomplices. The influence of Michel Nihal, who had connections to prominent politicians and businessmen and was photographed at events with high-profile figures. Skeptics respond that there's no direct physical evidence linking specific elite figures to the crimes. Witness X1's testimony contained inconsistencies. Alternative explanations exist for Dutrix's finances, fraud, criminal activities. The Belgian system had known problems with incompetence and communication breakdown. Some of the 27 deaths were clearly accidental or had non-sinister explanations. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Even if Dutrix wasn't directly serving an organized network of elite abusers, there's ample evidence that people in positions of power knew more than they admitted and failed to act when they could have stopped the crimes. Whether deliberate or incompetence-driven cover-up, the result was the same. System protection at the expense of vulnerable children. The Dutrix case had ramifications far beyond Belgium. It became a reference point for discussions about elite child abuse networks, institutional cover-ups, and the limits of conspiracy theory. In subsequent years, whenever allegations of high-profile child abuse emerged, the Jimmy Savile scandal in the UK, the Jeffrey Epstein case in the United States, allegations against the Catholic Church, people pointed to Dutrix as evidence that such networks could exist. The case also influenced how investigators approached allegations of organized abuse. Some became more willing to consider that elite abuse might be systematic rather than isolated cases. Others became more skeptical, concerned that the moral panic around Dutrix led to unfounded accusations. Investigative journalists from around the world studied the case, trying to understand what really happened and why so many investigations failed. Some concluded there had been a deliberate cover-up. Others blamed systemic incompetence and poor coordination between agencies. What's undeniable is that the Dutrix case exposed how vulnerable children can be when the institutions designed to protect them fail. It showed that predators can operate with relative impunity if they exploit gaps in the system. And it demonstrated that public trust, once shattered, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. Mark Dutrix remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. He has applied for release several times. Each application has been denied. He's now an elderly man, having spent more than 25 years imprisoned. From prison, Dutrix has continued making claims about a broader network. He's written letters to journalists, given rare interviews, insisted the real story has never been told. But after decades of lies and manipulation, few people give credibility to his words. Michelle Martin was released in 2012 and lives quietly in Belgium under strict restrictions. She's prohibited from contact with victims' families and is subject to regular monitoring. She remains one of the most hated figures in Belgian society. Michel Lelivre was released in 2019 after serving his sentence. His release was controversial but received far less attention than Martin's. Michel Nihal, who was widely suspected of being a key nexus between Dutrix and possible elite protectors, was never convicted of the main crimes. He was released after serving his sentence for drug trafficking and died in 2019, taking whatever secrets he may have had to the grave. Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez have rebuilt their lives as best they can. Sabine became an author and advocate. Both have asked for privacy as they continue dealing with the trauma of their experiences. The families of Julie, Melissa, and Yves continue to mourn. They continue to demand answers, and they continue to feel that justice was never fully served. So what do we learn from the Dutrix case? What is the truth we need to face? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: it doesn't matter whether there was an organized network of elite abusers or simply a monster exploiting a broken system. Because in both scenarios, the result is the same. Children suffered and died while those with the power to intervene did not. The question of conspiracy versus incompetence almost becomes irrelevant in the face of system failures so massive that they allowed Dutrix's crimes to continue for years. Whether intentional or not, the effect was the same: protection for the predator, death for the innocent. What we know with certainty, Dutrix was previously convicted of kidnapping and raping children, yet was released after only 3 years. Warnings about him were repeatedly ignored. Officers heard children's voices in his house but were instructed not to investigate. Julie and Melissa died while Dutrix was imprisoned and police had access to his house. Dozens of potential investigations were closed without explanation. Multiple witnesses described broader networks but weren't properly investigated. 27 people connected to the case died in unusual circumstances. The trial was strictly limited to Dutrix and immediate accomplices. These are facts, not theories, and they demand explanation. As you prepare for sleep tonight, listening to the rain, think about Julie Lejeune, Melissa Russo, and Marshall and Yves Lambrex. They were girls with entire futures ahead of them. They loved, laughed, dreamed. They deserved protection. They deserved justice. Think about Sabine and Laetitia, who survived but carry scars that will never fully heal. Think about how easily institutions can fail when those with the power to act choose not to, whether from fear, corruption, or simple apathy. The Dutrix case isn't just about a monster. It's about a system that allowed him to hunt. It's about missed opportunities, ignored warnings, lives that could have been saved. And it's a reminder that vigilance is eternal, that we must always question when authorities fail to protect the vulnerable, That silence in the face of evil is complicity. Julie, Melissa, and each deserve to be remembered, not as victims of a monster, but as children whose lives mattered, whose deaths demand that we do better. Rest in peace, little ones. Your story has been told, and it will not be forgotten. Good evening and welcome once again to this quiet space where real stories from the past find their moment to be told with calm. Tonight, we're going to talk about a case that shocked Spanish high society in August 1980. The murder of the Marquesas of Urquio, a crime that revealed dark secrets behind elegant doors. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Write your city, your country, what time it is for you. It's beautiful to know that in different places around the world, someone else is seeking these stories to rest. If you enjoy this content, narrated softly to help you relax, consider subscribing to the channel. Turn on notifications. And if you know someone else who seeks quiet stories, share this video. A like helps us greatly to reach more people who need this space of calm. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Madrid in 1980, to a mansion in the Salamanca district, where wealth and mystery met in a fatal way. The mansion on Lucana Street in Madrid's Salamanca district was imposing. Built at the beginning of the 20th century with a stone facade, tall windows, carved wooden doors. It was the type of building where Madrid's aristocracy lived. On the first floor lived the Marquesas of Urquio. Javier de Urquio, 74 years old, and his wife Maria de la Esperanza, 73. An elderly couple from one of Spain's most important families. The Urquio surname had history, power, money. They were bankers, aristocrats with connections in the highest circles of Spanish society. Javier was a serious man, educated, of the old school. He had dedicated his life to the family business, to maintaining the surname with dignity. Maria de la Esperanza was an elegant lady, discreet, who moved in the appropriate social circles. They lived quietly in their mansion, surrounded by art, antique furniture, a lifetime of privilege. They had employees who took care of the house. They received visits from family and friends of their same social level. But there was something else in that mansion, something very few knew. The Marquesas had a nephew, Rafael Escobedo, who had lived with them for years. Rafael was 28 years old. He was the son of Javier's sister who had died when Rafael was young. The Marquesas had taken him in as if he were their son. They had given him everything: education, home, money. But Rafael was not like his aunt and uncle. He was not serious, not hardworking. He was a young man who enjoyed the easy life, who spent money, who went out at night, who frequented places that his aunt and uncle would not approve of. The Marquesas were worried about Rafael. They had talked with him several times about his behavior, about his future. But Rafael did not listen. And in the summer of 1980, that tension was about to explode. August 1st, 1980 was a hot Friday. Madrid in August was always hot. Many families had left on vacation to the coast, to the mountains. But the Marquesas had stayed in Madrid. That afternoon, Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had been at home resting. The employees had already left. Only they and Rafael remained in the mansion. Around 9 in the evening, the Marquesas had dinner, light as always. Then they retired to their bedroom. It was their routine. They went to bed early. Rafael was in his room on the upper floor. But that night, Rafael was not alone. There was someone else in the mansion. Someone who had entered without anyone seeing. What we do know is what happened next. Around 11 at night, someone entered the Marquesas' bedroom. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza were sleeping, or perhaps reading before sleep. They were attacked brutally with a blunt object, probably a heavy candlestick or a fireplace poker. Both died there in their own bed. There was no struggle. There were no screams. They were surprised. Perhaps they didn't even fully wake before dying. It was quick, it was brutal, it was final. And after the crime, the killer or killers left. They closed the door, left the mansion in silence. And the night continued as if nothing had happened. The morning of Saturday, August 2nd, dawned sunny. The employees arrived at their usual time, around 9, to begin the day's tasks. They rang the bell. No one answered. That was strange. The Marquises were always awake at that hour. They used their key. They entered the house. Everything seemed normal, orderly, quiet. They called out, "Don Javier, Dona Esperanza." There was no response. They went up the stairs. They approached the bedroom. The door was closed. They knocked. Nothing. One of the employees opened the door, and what he saw left him paralyzed. The Marquises were in bed, motionless. There was blood on the sheets on the walls. It was a terrible scene. The employee ran out. He shouted to the others, "Call the police. The masters are dead." The police arrived within minutes. The Salamanca district was an important area. These things didn't happen there, not to families like the Urquios. The investigators examined the scene. 2 elderly people murdered in their bed, with blows to the head. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of robbery. The jewels were there, the money was there. Nothing of material value was missing. This was not a robbery. It was something personal, something close. The investigators began to ask, who had access to the house? Who knew the Marquises' routine? Who would benefit from their deaths? And all the answers pointed in the same direction. Rafael Escobedo, the nephew. The police looked for Rafael immediately, but he was not at the mansion. He was nowhere they could find. They interrogated the employees. They all said the same thing. Rafael lived there. He had keys. He knew the house. There had been tension lately between him and his aunt and uncle. The Marquises, according to the employees, had talked about changing their will. They were worried about Rafael's behavior, about how he spent money, about his friendships. Rafael was going to inherit a considerable fortune when his aunt and uncle died. But if they changed the will, that would change everything. The police began to build the theory. Rafael knew that his aunt and uncle were considering disinheriting him, and he decided to act before it was too late. But there was a problem. They couldn't find Rafael. He had disappeared completely. They put his photo in all the newspapers, in all the police stations. They alerted airports, train stations, ports. But Rafael seemed to have vanished. Days passed. The media pressure was enormous. The Urquios were an important family. This was national news. Everyone wanted to know who had killed the Marquises. And then, a week later, a call came to the police. A man who wouldn't give his name said he knew where Rafael was. The police followed the lead, and they found Rafael hidden in an apartment on the outskirts of Madrid, living with a friend who had helped him hide. They arrested him without resistance. Rafael knew he couldn't escape forever. At the police station, under interrogation, Rafael finally confessed. He said yes, that he had killed his aunt and uncle, but that he had not been alone, that he had had help. He mentioned an accomplice, but the details were always confusing. Some reports said it was a close friend, others that it was someone Rafael had hired. It was never completely clear. What was clear was that Rafael Escobedo, the nephew, the heir, had murdered the 2 people who had given him everything. Rafael Escobedo's trial began in 1981. It was a media trial. The newspapers covered every detail. Madrid's high society was shocked. How was it possible that a nephew would murder his own aunt and uncle? How could someone kill for money the people who had raised him? Rafael's defense tried to argue that he had had mental problems, that he had been under pressure, that he had not acted rationally. But the prosecution presented clear evidence. Rafael had planned the crime. He had waited for the moment when the employees were not there. He had acted with premeditation. And most damning, Rafael had confessed with details that only the killer could know. The jury found him guilty. Rafael Escobedo was sentenced to 30 years in prison for double murder. He served his sentence in various Spanish prisons. He was released on parole years later when he was already an older man. He tried to disappear from public life. He changed his identity, moved far from Madrid. The mansion on Lucana Street was sold by the family. No one wanted to live there after what had happened. The building changed owners several times. Today, it is a residential building divided into apartments. The Urquijo family never fully recovered from the tragedy. Not only had they lost two beloved members, they had also discovered that someone of their own blood was capable of something so terrible. The crime of the Marquesas of Urquijo reminds us that wealth does not protect from tragedy. That privilege does not guarantee security. That sometimes danger comes from where we least expect it. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had lived long lives, full lives. They had raised their nephew Rafael as if he were their son. They had given him love, home, future. And he, out of greed, out of impatience, for reasons that perhaps even he himself did not fully understand, took their lives. Two people in their 70s murdered in their own bed, in their own home by someone they trusted. It is a story that makes us reflect on human nature, on greed, on how money can corrupt even the strongest family ties. Tonight we have remembered Javier de Urquijo and Maria de la Esperanza. Two long lives ended brutally by someone who should have protected them. If this story accompanied you tonight, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Share your city, your country, your local time. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the past. Give it a like if you enjoyed the content, and share it with someone seeking quiet stories for the night. Good night. May you rest in peace. May your dreams be peaceful. Sweet dreams. Until the next story. In the heart of British Columbia, Canada, there exists a highway that has claimed more lives than any documented serial killer in North American history. Highway 16, a 724-kilometer stretch connecting Prince Rupert to Prince George, has another name among local residents, a name whispered with fear and pain, the Highway of Tears. And what makes this highway truly terrifying is not a single monster, but the possibility that multiple predators have been hunting along it for more than 5 decades. Where are you joining us from tonight? What time is it where you are right now? If you're looking for true stories to keep you awake while the rain falls, this is your refuge. Hit the subscribe button, turn on all notifications, give us a like, and share this video with someone who can't resist the darkest mysteries. Every interaction allows us to continue investigating the cases authorities prefer to forget. On June 11, 1969, a 19-year-old woman named Gloria Moody disappeared without a trace while hitchhiking on Highway 16. Her body was never found. Authorities filed the case as a voluntary disappearance, assuming she had simply decided to start a new life elsewhere. But what they didn't know was that Gloria would be only the first in a long list of women who would vanish on that highway as if the earth itself had swallowed them. What investigators would discover decades later about that stretch of asphalt would make them question whether they had been chasing a single killer or something far more sinister. Over the next 40 years, more women began to disappear along Highway 16. At first, the disappearances seemed like isolated events, individual tragedies with no apparent connection. Monica Ignaz, 15 years old, disappeared in 1974. Ramona Wilson, 16 years old, found dead in 1995. Roxanne Thiara, 15 years old, disappeared in 1994. The names accumulated like invisible tombstones along the highway. What was most disturbing was that most of the victims shared similar characteristics. They were young, many of them teenagers. Most were indigenous women from First Nations communities, belonging to populations that already faced systematic discrimination and extreme poverty. Almost all had been hitchhiking when they disappeared, a common practice in a region where public transportation was virtually non-existent, and many families couldn't afford a vehicle. But there was something else in the pattern that investigators didn't notice for years. The disappearances occurred more frequently during the summer months, between June and September, when the days were longer and more people traveled the highway. The bodies that were found showed signs of extreme sexual violence, and had been abandoned in remote forested areas, places so isolated that some weren't discovered until months or even years later. Whoever was doing this knew the territory intimately, knew exactly where they could hide their crimes without being detected. And what they would discover about the region's geography would reveal why this highway had become the perfect hunting ground for human predators. Highway 16 crosses through some of the most remote and wild terrain in North America. On both sides of the highway stretch dense coniferous forests that can swallow a person in seconds. Mountains rise abruptly, creating deep ravines and isolated valleys where a scream wouldn't reach any human ear. During winter, temperatures drop brutally, and during summer, mosquitoes and thick vegetation make venturing into the forest an exhausting experience. Sergeant Wayne Clary of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been assigned to the region for 15 years when he finally began connecting the dots in 2005. Sitting in his office in Smithers, a small town halfway along Highway 16, he spread out a map of the region and began marking each location where a woman had disappeared or where a body had been found. What he saw took his breath away. The marks formed a pattern along the highway, but they weren't uniformly distributed. They clustered in specific areas, near rest stops, on stretches where the highway crossed particularly isolated zones, at points where motorists frequently picked up hitchhikers. It's as if someone had studied the highway, Clary told his colleague, Detective Laurie Schenher, as if they knew exactly where to attack to maximize the chances of escaping without being seen. But what disturbed him most was something else he had noticed on the map, something that suggested they weren't dealing with a single predator. The dates didn't match. If all these disappearances and murders were the work of a single person, that person would have been active for more than 30 years, from the late 60s to the early 2000s. Although it wasn't impossible for a serial killer to operate for that long, something in the details of the crimes didn't fit that theory. The methods varied too much, the frequency was inconsistent, and some of the murders showed completely different levels of brutality. Dr. Michael Arntfield, a criminologist from Western Ontario University specializing in serial killers, was consulted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2006. After reviewing the available case files, his conclusion was chilling. "You're not looking for one killer," he told investigators during a video conference. "You're looking for several." This highway has attracted multiple predators over the decades, each one taking advantage of the same systemic vulnerabilities. Arntfield explained that Highway 16 represented what he called a perfect hunting ecosystem for human predators. Potential victims were abundant and vulnerable. Law enforcement was limited due to the vastness of the territory. Indigenous communities, where many of the victims came from, had learned to distrust the police due to decades of institutional racism and neglect. And most importantly, the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictions, making coordination between different police departments difficult. It was, in essence, the ideal place for a killer to operate with almost total impunity. But there was one specific case that would make Arntfield's entire theory take on an even more sinister meaning. Chapter 5. Nicole Hoare and the Turning Point. On June 21, 2002, Nicole Hoare, a 25-year-old white middle-class woman, disappeared while hitchhiking on Highway 16. Nicole was different from most of the previous victims. She was a university graduate, sister to a prominent lawyer, and came from a family with resources and connections. Her disappearance finally provoked the reaction that Indigenous families had been begging for during decades: national media attention and an exhaustive police investigation. The Hoare family didn't accept the police's vague answers. They hired private investigators, organized massive searches, pressured politicians, and most importantly, began asking questions about all the other women who had disappeared on the same highway. "Why is no one talking about the other girls?" asked Nicole's sister, Cara, at a 2003 press conference. "Why is it only now, when a white woman disappears, that everyone pays attention?" Cara Hoare's question resonated like thunder throughout Canada. The media began investigating, and what they discovered was shameful. Dozens of cases of missing Indigenous women had been filed with minimal or non-existent investigations. Families who had reported their daughters missing were ignored or, worse yet, blamed by police officers themselves who assumed the victims were involved in prostitution or drugs without any evidence. Systemic racism had not only allowed these women to disappear, but had protected their killers by ensuring no one would seek justice. And what would emerge from this new media attention would be a name that would horrify the entire nation. In 2006, a long-haul truck driver named Bobby Jack Fowler emerged as a prime suspect in several of the Highway of Tears murders. Fowler, an American from Oregon, had worked as a truck driver on routes that regularly took him through British Columbia during the 70s and 80s. He had an extensive criminal record of sexual assaults and had served time in prison for multiple rapes. The breakthrough came when Fowler's DNA, collected after his arrest in the United States for another crime, matched forensic evidence found on the body of one of the Highway of Tears victims, Colleen Macmillan, 16 years old, murdered in 1974. It was the physical connection that investigators had been searching for during decades. Finally, they had irrefutable proof that at least one of the Highway's killers had a name. But there was a devastating problem. Bobby Jack Fowler had died of cancer in an Oregon prison in 2006, before the DNA match was discovered. He would never face trial, never be interrogated about how many other women he had killed, and never reveal where he had hidden the bodies that still hadn't been found. His death closed a crucial door in the investigation, but opened another, even more disturbing question. If Fowler was responsible for some of the murders, who was responsible for the others? Because DNA analysis of the available crime scenes would reveal something no investigator wanted to hear. Forensic analysis of the cases where biological evidence had been recovered showed something that confirmed Dr. Arntfield's worst suspicions. There were multiple DNA profiles that didn't match Bobby Jack Fowler. This meant, without any doubt, that multiple killers had been operating on the Highway of Tears. The question was, how many? Detective Laurie Shunher, who had spent years working on missing women cases, organized a special meeting with criminologists, FBI profilers, and serial killer experts from across North America. In a conference room in Vancouver, she presented everything they knew. The data was overwhelming. Between 1969 and 2011, at least 18 women had been murdered or disappeared along Highway 16. But Indigenous rights organizations argued that the real number could be much higher, perhaps 40 or even 50 victims, whose cases were never officially reported or were filed without investigation. What we have here, explained FBI Special Agent Marcus Wright during the meeting, is what we call a hunting corridor. It's similar to what we saw with I-45 in Texas, where multiple killers used the same highway to find victims. Highway 16 offers everything a sexual predator looks for: vulnerable victims, extreme isolation, and fragmented law enforcement. Wright paused, letting his words settle. But there's something else you need to consider. Something that makes this case unique. What he was about to reveal would completely change the focus of the investigation. Agent Wright unfolded a map of North America on the conference room wall. With a red marker, he traced a line that followed Highway 16 in British Columbia, but then continued south, connecting with Interstate 5 running down the west coast to California, and east connecting with the Trans-Canada Highway that crossed the entire country. Long-haul truckers, Wright said, have access to thousands of kilometers of highways and a seemingly infinite supply of potential victims at every stop. Wright had been investigating a disturbing pattern of unsolved murders along major transportation routes in North America. He had identified more than 500 cases of women murdered or disappeared near interstate highways and major roads in the last 30 years. Many of the victims were sex workers or hitchhikers. The bodies, when they were found, had been abandoned at rest areas or in forests adjacent to the highways. Bobby Jack Fowler was a trucker, Wright continued, and he probably wasn't the only one using his profession to hunt. The FBI estimates that at any given time, there could be between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the United States, and a significant proportion of them are truckers or people whose occupations require extensive travel. The room fell silent. The implication was clear. The Highway of Tears wasn't just the hunting territory of one or two killers, but potentially a way station for predators traveling across the continent. And there was a case that would prove this theory in a chilling way. In 2007, Canadian authorities were contacted by investigators from Alaska with information about a case that would freeze their blood. A trucker named Robert Hansen had been arrested in 1983 for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of at least 17 women in Alaska. Hansen's modus operandi was terrifying. He would pick up women in Anchorage, take them to a remote cabin in the wilderness, release them, and then hunt them with a rifle as if they were animals. What connected Hansen to the Highway of Tears was his work route. During the 70s, Hansen had occasionally worked transporting cargo between Alaska and the Pacific Northwest states, a route that took him directly through Highway 16. Several witnesses remembered seeing his truck at rest stops along the highway. Although Hansen had died in prison in 2014 without confessing to any crimes in Canada, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that he had practiced his predation in British Columbia before escalating his crimes in Alaska. But Hansen wasn't the only suspect trucker. Police files contained references to other drivers who had been briefly questioned over the years but were never thoroughly investigated. An unidentified trucker who had attempted to attack a young woman in 1988 but who had escaped and reported the incident. Another driver who was seen arguing violently with a young woman at a rest stop hours before she disappeared. These fragments of information, ignored for decades, now painted a terrifying picture of a transportation corridor where multiple predators operated with almost total impunity. And what surviving victims would finally reveal would be even more disturbing. In 2009, a non-governmental organization called Women in March began collecting testimonies from Indigenous women who had survived kidnapping or assault attempts along Highway 16. What emerged from these interviews was a catalog of horror that had remained hidden for decades because no one had wanted to listen. Sarah Morrison, a woman from the Gikson Nation, described how in 1997, when she was 17 years old, she had accepted a ride from a truck driver who seemed friendly. Within minutes of entering the vehicle, the man began making explicit sexual comments. When Sarah demanded he let her out, he accelerated and activated the door locks. "He told me he knew of a place in the forest where no one would find me," Sarah recalled with a trembling voice. "He said he had taken other girls there before." Sarah only managed to escape when the truck had to stop at a traffic light on the outskirts of Terrace, and she broke the window and jumped from the moving vehicle. There were dozens of similar stories. Women who had been attacked but managed to escape. Women who reported the incidents to police only to be dismissed with comments like, "What did you expect hitchhiking?" Or, "You probably just wanted a free ride and then changed your mind." The pattern of police negligence was systematic and devastating. Each missed opportunity to arrest an aggressor meant he could attack again, and the next victim might not be lucky enough to escape. And among all these testimonies, there was one that would identify a predator who was still active and hunting. During interviews with survivors, one specific detail began to repeat with alarming frequency. Multiple women described being approached by a man driving a white pickup truck, specifically a Ford from the late 90s or early 2000s. The man was described as middle-aged, with dark hair and a well-groomed beard, and always wore a baseball cap. His tactic was consistent. He would offer help to women who were hitchhiking, seemed kind and trustworthy at first, and then revealed his true intentions once the victim was isolated. Detective Shunher ordered a search of the police database for all reports that mentioned a white pickup truck in connection with incidents along Highway 16. What she found was astonishing. There were at least 15 different reports, dating from 1998 to 2008, that mentioned a similar vehicle. Some were reports of failed sexual assaults. Others were sightings of a suspicious vehicle near where a woman had last been seen. What was most frustrating was that police had never connected these reports. Each one had been handled by different jurisdictions, filed separately, and never cross-referenced with other similar cases. If someone had taken the time to look for patterns, the man in the white truck could have been identified years earlier. Now, the urgent question was he still active? Was he still hunting on the Highway of Tears? The answer would come in a way no one anticipated. On November 27, 2010, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer stopped a pickup truck on the outskirts of Prince George for a minor traffic violation. The driver was a 20-year-old man named Cody Allen Leijbokoff. During the routine stop, the officer noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the back seat of the vehicle. A more detailed search revealed women's clothing, makeup, and a driver's license belonging to a woman who had been reported missing days earlier. The subsequent investigation would discover that Leijbokoff was responsible for the murder of at least 4 young women between 2009 and 2010. His victims included Jill Stuchenko, Cynthia Moss, Natasha Montgomery, and Loren Leslie. All had been brutally murdered, and their bodies had been abandoned in remote areas near Highway 16. Lichbokov, who worked in the lumber industry, knew the territory intimately and had used that knowledge to hide his crimes. What horrified investigators wasn't just the brutality of Lichbokov's crimes, but his age. At 20 years old, he was already an active serial killer. This suggested he had begun killing as a teenager and raised a chilling question. How had he learned to do this? Had he had a mentor? Had he been inspired by the uncaptured killers of the Highway of Tears? The forensic psychologists who interviewed him after his arrest would discover something that would connect Lichbokov to the broader pattern of violence in the region in a way no one had anticipated. During psychological evaluations, Lichbokov revealed that he had grown up hearing stories about the missing women of Highway 16. In his twisted mind, the Highway of Tears wasn't a place of tragedy, but of opportunity. "I knew I could get away with it," he told Dr. Patrick Bailey, a forensic psychologist. "So many others had done it before. Why not me?" This revelation exposed something deeply disturbing about the impact of unsolved crimes. The impunity of previous killers hadn't just caused immediate pain to victims' families, but had created a cascade effect, inspiring a new generation of predators who saw the highway as hunting territory where they could operate without consequences. Lichbokov had been, in essence, radicalized by the region's history of violence. In 2014, Cody Lichbokov was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He was the youngest serial killer in Canadian history, but his capture didn't bring the closure many had hoped for, because even while Lichbokov was being tried, another woman disappeared on Highway 16. Madison Scott, 20 years old, was last seen in May 2011 at a campground near Vanderhoof. Her truck was found abandoned, but there was no sign of Madison. The case remains unsolved. The Highway of Tears continued to claim victims, and what this meant was clear and terrifying.